You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
It's a hot one here in coastal Virginia, and apparently it is up there too in, what do we call it, Northwest Connecticut, okay? Sort of.
And our version of hot for our listeners across the country and around the world is 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And what's it doing in Virginia?
It is 95 actual degrees Fahrenheit with a heat index of 110, which means I'm not going running for the foreseeable future.
No, unless you go early in the morning when it's cool.
And not even then, because it's also, unfortunately, way too humid here.
Yeah.
So there's nothing good about this weather, unfortunately.
No, it is summertime. I was talking to somebody this morning who has a house in Arizona, in Scottsdale. And they said it was 115 degrees in Scottsdale. They're here in Connecticut for the summer. They are people that are fortunate enough to be able to split their time between beautiful Scottsdale, Arizona, 7 months of the year, and then the northwest corner of Connecticut, which is, I think, equally beautiful, for 5 months of the year. It sounds civilized. For our friends in the southwest part of the United States, ouch, 115 degrees?
I was complaining about the heat earlier on social media, and a friend of mine said, wait, aren't you from Arizona? I said, no, I'm from here. I lived in Arizona, and because I have lived in both places, I can tell you it does not matter that it is a dry heat. 115 degrees is still awful. And it is possible, by the way, because when I got to Arizona, I did check. You can bake cookies in your car. It is possible.
Really?
Bake cookies. Yes, it is. It is possible to bake cookies in your car if you leave them in a closed car long enough. It is possible. I tried frying an egg on the sidewalk. That does not work nearly as well, but you can make cookies in your car.
Well, on that curious note, I guess we should get started.
We had some very interesting case breaks here in the last month or so, especially when we learned about the identification of a now deceased suspect in the 1996 murders of Julie Williams and Lollie Winans. But that case took an even more unexpected turn just a couple of days ago when, seemingly out of the clear blue sky, we received a link from a close colleague to an article that stated that Darrell David Rice, who had long been a main suspect in the murders of Julie Williams and Lollie Winans, had very unfortunately been struck and killed by a car mere days after his exoneration in this case. And that is news, I think, that threw both of us for a loop.
Completely unexpected, and we have to thank Courtney Stewart, a longtime journalist in Charlottesville, friend of the pod, and I've also appeared on her podcast and done radio interviews with her. She's a radio host in Charlottesville. I think there was some local coverage of Darrell David Rice's untimely demise, and we'll get into details in a second. As far as I know, Courtney was the first person to break the news in Virginia. It hasn't gotten as much coverage as I would like to have seen, and I still find it really shocking that Darrell David Rice was struck and killed by a car while on his bicycle in Missouri, and it was reported to have taken place the evening of July 5th.
So what we'd like to do is we would like to anchor our coverage with a story from the Daily Progress by reporter Haz Spencer. We're going to go through, walk you through the particulars here. We'll both offer color commentary as wanted and needed and required. And we'll go from there and talk about the ins and outs of this and why this is so very odd.
One thing I'll mention, too, Haz Spencer is a name I've known for years, but had only recently connected with. He's a longtime journalist himself in Charlottesville. And those of you that are from Virginia may remember the newspaper The Hook, which was a weekly alternative newspaper in Charlottesville, which did some really good coverage of a number of issues. In particular, when you go back and look for older articles on the Julie Williams Lollie Winans murder, the Shenandoah murders, as well as the Route 29 stalker case, many of those articles are written by Courtney Stewart, and the editor at that time was Hawes Spencer. So both of these journalists have long histories with this case and know it quite well. Very interesting to reconnect with Hawes Spencer just in the past few weeks before the news about Darrell Rice's passing. And now he's writing about this case again after a number of years.
We should also mention that we have been doing guest shots on some of our other podcast colleagues' podcasts with regard to not only the Shenandoah case, but also what happened to Darrell David Rice. We are going to include links on our Facebook pages and our show notes to Crime Analyst and to Real Crime Profile, where we have been doing guest shots on both of these. If you want to get double the coverage, we will make sure that we have links to all of those in our show notes. We'll go ahead and kick this off. This is from the Daily Progress from Hawes Spencer. This is from July 8th, 2024. The headline reads, "Weeks after he was exonerated in Shenandoah murder case, Darrell Rice struck and killed by car." And the subhead, "A mere 15 days after his exoneration, it's unclear if he even knew his name had been cleared."
One interesting observation, people like Kristin Dilley and Bill Thomas, Hawes Spencer, Courtney Stewart, and other journalists, and of course his legal team, are using the word exonerated. Kristin, you pointed out in our last week's episode where we were discussing the lack of clarity in these recent press conferences. We're using the word exonerated or exoneration. It's quite notable that the FBI refuses to use words like exonerated. I think that compounds the tragedy of Darrell Rice being hit and killed in the middle of a significant development. I think that's fair. In the Shenandoah case, his name has been attached to that case for over 20 years. There's a real tragedy mixed in here, which we'll get into as we take a look at the article.
The article begins just 15 days after he was cleared of culpability in the 1996 Shenandoah National Park double slaying that clouded his life for 22 years. Darrell Rice died on a dark highway halfway between St. Louis and Kansas City. The Missouri State Highway Patrol reported that the 56-year-old was riding a bicycle when he was struck and killed by a car on Friday evening. That would be July the 5th. It's just difficult to wrap your brain around it, Rice's longtime defense attorney, Gerald Zirkin, told the Daily Progress. It is obviously difficult to accept the extraordinary coincidence that he is killed within days of being exonerated, but that would appear to be the case. I like his use of the word extraordinary coincidence. When the story first dropped the other night, my first thought was, this guy has just been cleared and suddenly hit by a car? I don't know. I'm not one to buy into conspiracy theories because I don't think that's a path that lends itself to anything good. However, the fact that this guy was just cleared but then somehow ends up dead, it made little tiny alarm bells in my head start ringing. Bill, did it do the same thing for you?
It did, and there's so much about this case, and I'm referring now to Darrell David Rice's death in a cycling accident, that just seems off. Rice is killed almost 1,100 miles away from his last known address, which is a small town outside Durango, Colorado. And in our communication with journalists and other people that have worked with Rice, no one's clear on what the heck he was doing in Missouri, almost 1,100 miles away from his home. Mm-hmm. He was an avid cyclist his entire life. He had actually ridden across the country from Colorado to Maryland, where he had family, and he had lived there at one point. He had done that at least once before, but no one was aware of him leaving Colorado and riding across these adjoining states, which would have taken him through Missouri. The whole thing just seems so bizarre. And let's get into the details of the article. I think there's so much about this that just doesn't feel right. And I'm not a big conspiracy theorist either. There's something truly tragic about this. And I'm not the biggest fan of Darrell Rice personally. I've never met the man. But while I understand that he was absolutely not guilty and was never guilty of any involvement in the Julie Williams, Lollie Winans murders, which are truly horrible, I do think he was guilty of other crimes, and I think he had serious mental health issues and a lot of personal internal challenges that resulted in his sometimes bizarre behavior. Something about this whole thing just is not sitting right with me. It almost strains credibility, and a number of our listeners, when we put up some of these early articles from Courtney Stewart and other journalists, expressed real skepticism. I'll let you continue.
In early 2002, Rice was indicted by a Charlottesville-based federal grand jury 6 years after 24-year-old Julie Williams and 26-year-old Laura Lollie Winans were found dead at a campsite near Skyland Lodge in Shenandoah National Park shortly after Memorial Day in 1996. Passionate about the wilderness and each other, the couple was found naked, bound and gagged, their throats cut. It was then U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft who named Rice as the suspect, and under the belief that the two women had been targeted because of their sexual orientation, announced that the murders had been elevated to a federal hate crime, meaning Rice was eligible for the death penalty. When another man's DNA was found on the devices used to bind the two women, the government dropped the charges against Rice, but reserved the right to reinstate them.
Let me stop you there for a second. One of the things that's really been bothering me about the horrific lack of information from the FBI at these recent press conferences, as we discussed on Mind Over Murder last week, is open questions like this. I remember when the other man's DNA was discovered on the bindings. I think it was on the tape. And there were a lot of questions about whose DNA that might be. I think those questions could be resolved now using advanced forensics. I'd like to see the FBI pursue these avenues. Whose DNA was on the bindings? They've never said. Given how much of a big deal they made about Rice and how they were going to see that case all the way through up to and including his execution, you'd think that they'd go back and revisit this and figure out, okay, that DNA that we discovered all those years ago, whose DNA is it?
Yeah, now that we do have a suspect, Walter Leo Jackson, let's go ahead and run that. Is that Walter Leo Jackson's DNA? Is that someone else's? We are still trying to figure out a lot of information about Walter Leo Jackson, and that is a process that I think is going to continue, or rather, let me rephrase, that is a process that I hope is going to continue. I hope that the FBI does not just say, we've got it, and that's it. I hope that they're going to continue. Bill, for the record, Bill is making a skeptical face there. I think that given the amount of time, attention, and resources that the Bureau has recently put back into this case, I think that they owe it to everybody who may possibly have been impacted by Walter Leo Jackson. They owe it to everybody to go through and really see this through to fruition. Check every single DNA source that was available. Check all of his whereabouts. We know that this guy is a truly heinous and awful kidnapper and serial rapist. They really owe it to anybody who may have been impacted by this guy to see this investigation all the way through. And I sincerely hope that they're going to continue to do that by testing every piece of evidence that's available against Jackson. But I think only time is going to tell on that.
The other issue, of course, is that there could be DNA from multiple sources, and there may be more than one offender. So actually doing a complete job of analysis and review of all of the evidence might lead them to conclude that Jackson had an accomplice. That's a question that should be answered as well. I see lots of reason to move forward, and I see right now little to no initiative being shown by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in terms of actually pursuing all the avenues in this case, at least based on their remarkably short and light on information press conference of a few weeks ago.
The cloud over Rice only lifted on June 20th. When the FBI announced that a Cleveland-based serial rapist who died 6 years ago, Walter Leo Jackson Sr., was the actual killer. The FBI said that multiple DNA tests showed that Jackson raped and murdered both women. Zirkin said that a factor compounding the tragedy of Rice's death is that he may never have learned that forensic testing had cleared his name. He was very much off the grid as the result of the government's unending persecution and the internet's perpetuation of the false cases against him, said Zirkin.
One of the things we've learned about Rice recently is he was so off the grid that he didn't have a cell phone and he didn't have a computer. The folks from the Innocence Project, Deirdre Enright and Jerry Zirkin, his longtime attorneys, were actually trying to reach him with this information, and we're not having a lot of luck because if you think about it, if you don't have a phone and you don't have a computer in the modern age, 2024, you've made yourself difficult to find. So they weren't even certain that they knew how to connect with him.
And if it turns out that he died in this bicycle accident without ever learning that he had in fact been cleared, exonerated, use whatever verb you think is appropriate, although the FBI definitely isn't using either of those two, I think that's an awful tragedy that compounds the awfulness of it. And I feel truly terrible for Darrell David Rice. Rice came to the attention of law enforcement in 1997 when he attacked a female bicyclist along Skyline Drive not far from the scene of Williams and Winans' murder. He later pleaded guilty to attempted kidnapping, and the woman whom he threatened and implored to get in his pickup truck testified at his sentencing that she was certain he was going to kill her. Charlottesville City Councilor Lloyd Snook wasn't so sure. He was Rice's defense attorney in that case. I can't say I ever really understood him, Snook told the Daily Progress. Certainly what he was convicted of was very bizarre behavior. Such behavior got Rice an 11-year federal sentence that stretched out to additional time due to post-release infractions, including failing to report to work, moving outside prescribed geographic boundaries, and attempting suicide. However, the government's murder case was based solely on snitches and circumstances, such as being in the park that fateful weekend. They had only tissue paper thin evidence against him, said Snook.
This is the origin of my dislike of Rice, in that I do believe he was guilty of attacking this other woman, and I'm glad that she survived. I'm not certain that case would have escalated to murder. He clearly was disturbed, and he had a number of mental health issues over the years. I'd gotten some pushback when we were talking with another colleague recently. I thought I had read somewhere that Rice had attempted suicide at some point. Hawes Spencer here is mentioning that, and I am fairly certain I've read that before. When we get into the details of the bicycle accident, the idea that this could have been a suicide attempt on Rice's part crossed my mind. You'll see more as the story unfolds.
While the Shenandoah murder case against him was dropped in 2004, state prosecutors suggested with a subsequent indictment that Rice may have been behind the mysterious disappearance of women along a stretch of US 29 between Manassas and Charlottesville. The so-called Route 29 stalker was blamed for the attempted abduction of at least 20 women in the mid-90s, hailing them onto the side of the highway and telling them their cars were throwing sparks. The figure also was blamed for the disappearance of at least 9 women into the 2010s. Of those later cases, only 3 were ever closed, resulting in the conviction of 2 different men on murder charges. Those, of course, are the cases of Morgan Harrington and Hannah Graham, who were killed by serial killer Jesse Matthew, and that of Alexis Murphy, who was killed by serial killer Randy Taylor, who may also be responsible for the murder of Samantha Clark. In 1996, the same year as the Shenandoah murders, Harrisonburg native Alicia Showalter Reynolds was found dead in Culpeper County after she was last seen standing along US 29 with a man peering at her car's engine. Rice, his lawyers said, took a plea in one such stalking case only because he won a deal with no additional jail time and because the government seemed willing to reach across jurisdictions to convict Rice of something.
And this is the part that gets very frustrating because once Rice was in the crosshairs of the FBI and the National Park Service, it was like they couldn't let go. And even though the evidence in the Shenandoah case clearly indicated that it was not Rice who was responsible for those murders, and we know now that it was Walter Leo Jackson, it felt like the FBI just turned into Inspector Javert and just couldn't let Rice go as a suspect. And it was one charge after another, all of which seemed designed to extend his jail stays and put more pressure on him, even though they had the wrong guy.
We spent a little bit of time on this subject when we talked to Laura Richards of Crime Analyst the other day. A Google search will take you to some really interesting pieces of information with regard to Darrell David Rice. And one of the things that I found was a notice of intent to seek the death penalty against Rice. It lists a ton of evidence, a lot of which our colleague Kate Miles has said is either overblown or completely fabricated. And it lists all of these things, including the Route 29 stalkings, that they believed Rice was capable of, with tissue paper thin evidence. It is very frustrating to see really how hard the government was gunning for this guy. And we'll put links to that particular document in our show notes as well. Quote, from the beginning, the government manipulated the evidence against Rice and in some cases fabricated it, said Zirkin during a June 24 press conference after Rice's name was cleared in the Shenandoah case. The preliminary accident report filed by the Missouri State Highway Patrol indicates that Rice was riding a bicycle around 9:52 p.m. Friday in rural Chariton County near the Missouri River. Although he was in Missouri, Rice's address was listed as Montrose, Colorado at the time of his death. I didn't know he was in Missouri, Zirkin said, nor did the local sheriff, who saw Rice cycling near the town of Salisbury, a little more than 11 miles east of the accident site earlier Friday. He was riding on the shoulder at that point in daylight, so I didn't think much about it, Chariton County Sheriff Eric Billups told the Daily Progress. But at night, shortly before the crash, two sheriff's deputies noticed Rice pedaling without lights or reflectors near the center of the two-lane US 24, the county's main thoroughfare. They were going to turn around to check on him when a car came over the hill and hit him, said Billups. The sheriff said that one deputy witnessed the impact and that both rendered CPR until medics arrived. Rice, he said, was airlifted to a hospital where he died.
There's so much about this that just isn't working for me. He's almost 1,100 miles away from his last known address. None of the people that he is close with, his attorneys, his sister, and other people who had assisted him in the past. Remember, I mentioned he had once ridden across the country from Colorado to Maryland on a bicycle. They provided financial assistance because Rice wasn't able to work because he was harassed everywhere he went because people would find out that he was a suspect in a brutal homicide, that of Julie Williams and Lollie Winans. People would get very upset about the fact that they thought there was a killer living in their midst. As it turns out, he wasn't a killer. He struggled mightily in the 22 years after the FBI went after him so aggressively. The strange thing is, Rice riding a bicycle from Colorado, perhaps to Maryland or someplace east, is not out of the question. He wasn't able to do those things without some form of financial assistance from his attorneys and his family. None of them were in contact with him regarding a planned bicycle trip. So there's something about this that just, as I said, it just doesn't sit well with me that this guy is almost 1,100 miles away from his last known address. And this is about 88 hours on a bicycle, according to Google Maps, which would be days and days of riding. It almost feels like he might have headed out from his home near Durango, Colorado. Perhaps he did have some way of knowing that there had been significant news in the case that he had been charged in so many years ago. I just don't know, and now we're not going to be able to ask him. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. Before we get back to the podcast, just wanted to remind you that we have a GoFundMe effort going on right now. This campaign is designed to help us raise funds to help promote Mind Over Murder and specifically to push the Colonial Parkway Murders investigation forward. We'd love it if you could support us in any way that you can. Any donation from $5 to whatever you can afford is very much appreciated and will be incredibly helpful. The link is in the show notes and in our social media pages. As always, thanks for your support. Now back to Mind Over Murder.
Bill, one thing that I think our listeners are going to be very interested in is the fact that you also are a cyclist. This isn't a trip that you would take on your own and unsupported, correct? Like, you would need to have a place to stay. You would need to have resources available to you. If you're taking your bike all that way, would you need to stop at various points for mechanical issues or anything? Like, I am not a long haul cyclist, so I have no idea, but I know that you said you cycled. So would you make this kind of trip unsupported with no financial resources or help?
No, I don't think so. And I would love to see the bicycle that he was riding and see if it was set up properly for what would be referred to as long-distance touring. If he left Colorado and rode east, which would take him through Missouri, he's about midway through Missouri at the place where he's struck by the car. It's near Salisbury, Missouri. These are very rural highways, by the way. The sheriff had mentioned in one of the articles I read that there are only 7,000 people in the entire county. It's very spread out. Rice might have been able to make the trek on his bicycle. He's 56 years old and in good physical condition. He wouldn't necessarily have to stay in hotels. I'd like to see the bicycle. Does it have panniers on it, panniers, which are the bags on the back of and front of bicycles to help carry gear? I mean, at a minimum, he'd have to have food, some clothing to change into, perhaps a simple toolkit to keep his bicycle going, a couple of spare tubes. If he's not staying in hotels or motels as he rides along, and much more likely is camping out, then he's likely got to have a sleeping bag, perhaps a lightweight tent. When I heard about the accident and then got onto Google Maps to see where the heck is this, my first thought was I was hoping his family could see his body to confirm that it was him and how he died. And the second thing is I would dearly like to see photographs of the bicycle, what it looked like after the accident, and does it have any of the gear that I've described, which a long-distance cyclist would need.
The state report indicates that the collision destroyed the car, a 2001 Nissan Maxima, driven by a 31-year-old man. A 22-year-old female passenger was taken to a hospital for the treatment of minor injuries. Now, someone on our Facebook page did express some incredulity with the statement, the collision destroyed the car. They said, how does a bike destroy a car? Would a car hitting a bike at the speed that they were going, would that actually total the car? Can you give some information about that?
Sure. First of all, this article says destroyed. Some of the other articles we said they used the word totaled. Now, this is a 2001 Nissan Maxima, so it's an older car. It doesn't have a lot of inherent value. If this person driving the car strikes Rice and does enough damage to his car. I believe the driver is a male. That car could be totaled by his insurance company. That doesn't mean the car, Hawes Spencer uses the expression destroyed. I think it could mean, for all intents and purposes, the damage to the car exceeds the remaining value of the car. Now, a couple of things, though. Let's just say, I don't exactly know how much Darrell Rice weighed, but let's say he weighs 175 pounds. I'm completely making that up. He looks tall and thin in the photographs I've seen of him. And he's on a bicycle, which puts him in an elevated position. If he is struck by a car, a man's body is then thrown by the car. It could do a significant amount of damage to the vehicle. We've had incidents here in Connecticut recently where people have been struck by cars and large animals, deer, moose, etc., have been struck by vehicles, and they've done a tremendous amount of damage. Now, a moose is a whole nother category because they can be 1,200 pounds. Darrell Rice and his bicycle were up over 200 pounds, and it might have some of the equipment that we talked about as well. He might have bags and packs and things like that. He's obviously very badly injured. They medevaced him out of there on a rescue helicopter and were unable to save his life. I absolutely think that if you struck someone who they claim was riding down the center line of the highway, which may have been to avoid the dark edge of the road where there might have been broken glass or debris or things like that, this accident happened at nearly 10 p.m., so it's well after dark. It's possible that Rice might have put himself in this situation because he was trying to avoid the edge of the road. He might have been riding after dark because it was cooler. We started off this episode of Mind Over Murder talking about how hot it's been. Now, I can go back and take a look at the weather for Missouri. It was only a couple of weeks ago. My guess is it was pretty hot, and he might have been trying to avoid the heat of the sun. That may be another reason for him riding at night. Now, the lack of lights and reflectors, these are unfortunate choices, it would appear. But I am highly confident that an older vehicle striking a grown man and a bicycle would do significant damage to the cyclist and to the car.
Before he was prosecuted for attacking the cyclist in Shenandoah National Park, Rice was a computer programmer living in Maryland. But the murder prosecutions and archived press reports kept Rice unemployed and on the move, his lawyer said. Darrell has been forced to be off the grid due to all the horrible media coverage of his case and what the government has done, said Zirkin. He's just been trying to survive and can't get a job and was driven into hopelessness. That is the great tragedy of false accusations.
Jerry Zirkin's got a lot of good points here. This crusade to go after Darrell David Rice without ever proving that he was responsible for the murder of Julie Williams and Lollie Winans, and they never proved that he was responsible for the murder of Alicia Showalter Reynolds and the other victims in the Route 29 stalker case. Yet they continued to harass him to the extreme, I believe, for decades, is part of the reason why he gets killed out on this lonely highway at 10 o'clock at night, 1,100 miles from his last known address.
There's a lot of very interesting questions here that I think we're all really looking forward to having answers to. Some of those questions we may never have answers to, unfortunately. I think that the tragedy of all of this is that this man who had been persecuted, there's really no better word for it, in a case that he demonstrably was not at fault for, has now died, and it is entirely possible he did not know his name was cleared. And I think that is just a tragedy of the highest order. I feel really terrible about this. Like I said, I don't like to go down the conspiracy route because nothing good ever comes from that. But it does feel the timing's a little odd. Let's just put it that way.
I'd have to agree. It occurred to me that Darrell Rice could have been in a strong position to sue the FBI and the Virginia State Police. His decision, not something he would have ever discussed with us. We didn't have a relationship with the man. I just knew about him for all these years. With this just relentless pursuit of Rice for all of these years, Certainly the FBI and the National Park Service couldn't have known in 2002 when they were charging Rice, but by the time their own forensic expert testified that it was not Rice, whose DNA was found on the edges of the bindings, which I believe were duct tape. Certainly, by the time several more years had gone by and more work had been done, it was very clear that Rice was not the right suspect. Yet they kept going after him. And at the same time, when we have FBI agents like Jane Collins driving around in their vehicles, and this was widely reported in The Hook and other newspapers, the Washington Post, a number of media sources reported that there seemed to be resistance by the FBI and the National Park Service to conduct the additional forensic testing that was required, which I believe would have cleared Rice much earlier. Rice wasn't the right guy. Now we have an announcement in 2024 that Walter Leo Jackson raped and murdered Julie Williams and Lollie Winans. By the way, the sexual assault was news to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
There's a tremendous gap then between 2002 and 2024. That's about 22 years. I believe the FBI knew that Rice wasn't the right guy a number of years ago.
Well, do you want to share the conversation that you had with one of the former FBI agents on the Colonial Parkway Murders case when he mentioned to you in a phone call that they felt they had a good suspect for Shenandoah?
It seemed to me like the FBI just couldn't let go. I recall a conversation that I had a number of years ago. This has to be around 2010 because this was during the time frame where he was handling the case. This is before our current case agent. He had just attended a briefing at FBI Richmond. He was based in the FBI Norfolk office. And he told me, we have a suspect in the Julie Williams Lollie Winans case, and he was very confident about it. And I said, if you tell me that the name of the suspect is Darrell David Rice, I'm going to spit. And he said, it's Darrell David Rice. And I said, good-naturedly, I hope, that's the sound of me spitting. And I said to him at the time, you guys haven't been able to prove that it's been Darrell David Rice for all these years. Why aren't you more open to the idea that it could have been someone else? You've been dragging around this evidence since 1996, and you still can't prove that it's Rice. Why aren't you open to other suspects? And of course,
it's a great question.
Here it is all these years later, and it turns out it's not Rice. I really do think that the FBI knew it wasn't Rice a number of years ago. And when Stanley Meter came in as the new special agent in charge in the Richmond office and ordered a top-to-bottom review of this case, and I appreciate the fact that he did this, that led directly to them re-examining all the evidence, which should have happened before 2021, but it is what it is. There's just a pattern here with the FBI of foot dragging in these cases that I do not understand. And now we have this situation where they're finally identifying suspects, all of whom are conveniently dead. It's troubling that the FBI dragged its feet literally for decades while these men were alive. We have situations like in the Colonial Parkway murders, we have Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. dying in 2017. Had he been re-examined earlier, he could have spent the last part of his life in jail where he belonged. The same thing with Walter Leo Jackson. As we were discussing on Crime Analyst, there's a very disturbing pattern, and we're going to have to do some more digging on this one. Why was Walter Leo Jackson Sr. serving such short sentences for increasingly serious kidnapping and rape? Are there other cases that he was involved in where he wasn't charged? There's just so many odd things about this. But now, conveniently, he's dead, and the FBI is saying, aha, we solved the case. But they're solving the case after these people have died. I appreciate the hard work, but I can't help but think if they had refocused their resources years ago, these people could have been identified and appropriately punished.
What I'll do is once I've read a book, let's say I've read Kate Miles' Trailed, I will sit and I will annotate all throughout the book, as any good English teacher would do. But then I'll sit and I'll write my findings out on legal pads so that I can have them right in front of me. And one of the things that I was noticing the other day is the fact that Darrell David Rice was convicted for his assault on Yvonne Malbasha, the cyclist in Shenandoah, and he should have been convicted for that. He absolutely should have. That was not anything that anyone deserves to have done to them. He deserved to be convicted. He deserved to do crime. He was sentenced to 14 years for that attempted kidnapping and sexual assault. Meanwhile, you've got Walter Leo Jackson, who's convicted of truly heinous rape, kidnapping, and assault, and he's doing not nearly that amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't understand some of the sentencing guidelines, and I realize they vary from state to state. I'm looking at some of these things and asking myself, okay, so Darrell David Rice gets 14 years in 1998 for the assault on Yvonne Malbasha. And like I said, he did deserve to be sentenced for that. Absolutely. I'm not saying that he didn't deserve that. At the same time, you've got very different sentencing for two very different men and very different types of crimes. Even once the case against Darrell David Rice was ultimately dismissed, it was dismissed without prejudice. They could bring it back at any point and retry it at any time. And I don't understand why they ultimately decided, you know what, we want to reserve the right to bring this up again and again and again. I don't understand what the thinking was here. And I really do feel badly for Darrell David Rice. I am not, as you said, I'm not a member of the Darrell David Rice fan club. He was not necessarily the best guy in the whole entire world, but he did not deserve what he got from the FBI at all, in any way, shape, or form. No one deserves to be persecuted like this. And that is what it is. It was persecution. No one was served well in this case. And I do truly feel very badly for Darrell, for what his life ultimately became, and now for how his life ended. And the fact that, like I said, I know I keep coming back to it, but it feels almost like Greek tragedy to me. The fact that he may not have even known at the end of his life that he had been exonerated in this crime that had plagued him for so many years.
I'd like to think that he may have found out somehow that there was news and that he had been exonerated. I can't help but think that's why he got on his bicycle and started heading east from Colorado. Perhaps we'll find out someday that he mentioned it to someone, or that he somehow found out, even though he hadn't yet spoken to his attorneys or his family, that he decided to head east. And perhaps I'm romanticizing this a little bit, but I almost pictured him as heading back towards his old life. We'll see if we ever find out if there's any truth to this. But I understand your analogy about the Greek tragedy. This is just so horrible. I think Jerry Zirkin hits the nail on the head when he says that is the great tragedy of these false accusations.
Absolutely. So we did do some additional coverage on this with Crime Analyst and with Real Crime Profile. And so we will provide links to both of those episodes when they drop in our show notes and on our Facebook and social media pages. Obviously, the saga of Darrell David Rice, Walter Leo Jackson, and the break in the Shenandoah case is not 100% closed. I'm hoping that we will hear more in the coming days if the FBI continues to do their work. More about, again, Bill gets the eye roll.
You can probably hear that.
You can hear it through the audio.
Your headphones.
I'm hoping that we will have more information on Walter Leo Jackson and any other potential victims. I sincerely hope that he is being looked at as a potential Route 29 stalker suspect. I truly do. And I'm hoping that maybe in the coming weeks or months, maybe we will get a break in those cases as well. I sincerely hope that, for example, Sadie Showalter and Alicia Showalter Reynolds' family can finally know some peace and have some answers as to what happened to Alicia. But I'm assuming that maybe that's a couple weeks or months down the road. We will see. That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. As always, if you like what we're doing here, please make sure you leave us a 5-star rating or review on whatever podcast platform you currently listen to. Please do talk us up to your friends, neighbors, and even your enemies. We just need listeners so that we can keep doing what we're doing. We do have merchandise available at TeePublic. Please do check us out there for the best quality t-shirts about Mind Over Murder True Crime Podcast. Look for some more information coming soon about some special events here in the great state of Virginia. As always, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.